Hello Steelers, and welcome to this painting video which I'm going to show you how I painted this 15mm scale French First World War tank. This is a Saint-Chamond tank that was used by the French forces from 1917 onwards, and it has a very distinctive look, including the camouflage. The model was released by the Plastic Soldier Company as part of their Great War board game, and it's a very detailed vehicle. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of tanks in the First World War, and in particular the French tanks, before getting to the painting. So I will put chapters in the video so you can skip past this if you just want to get to the painting part. The history of tanks begins in the First World War with experiments based on the Holt tractor, carried out by the Landships Committee, which was created by Winston Churchill in 1915. In an effort to break the trench deadlock, the committee required an armoured vehicle to be able to support infantry, cross trenches and also destroy barbed wire. And in 1915, the world's first tank, Little Willie, was developed. Although Little Willie was never used in combat, it then led on to the Mother, a large rhomboid-shaped vehicle with tracks running the length of the body to aid crossing rough ground. Weapons were mounted in sponsons on either side of the vehicle, and the type was divided between the male with 6-pounder guns and the female carrying machine guns. To keep the project secret, the new vehicle was referred to as a water carrier for Mesopotamia, which was then shortened to tank. Now, named the Mark I, the new weapon went into action on the 15th of September 1916 on the urging of Field Marshal Douglas Haig at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Although it wasn't a particularly auspicious start, with many of the vehicles breaking down before jumping off, the new weapon caused tank panic in the German lines, and it changed the face of warfare forever. The British developed several types of tanks throughout the war, including the most numerous, the Mark IV, which saw action throughout 1917 and 1918. Gun carriages and transport vehicles were also developed, which indicates the diversity of armoured fighting vehicles to come in the Second World War and beyond. Despite this, the tank was not a war-winning weapon and was used very differently to AFVs in the next war. It primarily had an infantry support role, designed to attack strong points, holding up the advance and create paths through barbed wire. Britain produced over 2,500 heavy tanks during the First World War, along with about 200 light Whippet tanks. Germany only developed one type of tank during the war, and this was the famous A7V, named after the committee that designed the vehicle. This had a crew of 18 compared to the 8-man crew in the British Mark IV, and only 20 were ever built. However, the first tank versus tank combat took place during the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux in April 1918, where 3 A7Vs clashed with several British Mark IVs and Whippet light tanks. Mainly, Germany also relied on 50 captured British Mark IV tanks as the core of their armour during the war. This was due to the fact that they were mostly on the defensive in the West, apart from a few notable operations, so they had very little use for tanks. A very different story would emerge in World War II. As the British were beginning to design tanks, the French were also looking into the possibility of using armoured vehicles to break the deadlock. However, unlike Britain, who formed a committee to steer their development, the French relied on individual manufacturers to produce their own vehicles, which caused its own problems of disparate working and development. Of 3 main manufacturers, Schneider, an arms manufacturer, took the lead in early 1915, basing a design on the Baby Holt tractor, which in turn was seized upon by the military authorities, who then pushed for over 800 vehicles to be built. Further problems arose from the Army's requirement for haste, and the first French tank, or char, known as a Schneider CA, had a crew of 6 and mounted a short 75mm howitzer, but it suffered greatly from a lack of manoeuvrability due to an overhanging chassis and short tracks. It was also mechanically unreliable, with only about 130 of the 400 built ever being in operation at the same time. The development phase lasted through 1916, and it was only in April of 1917 that the CA1 first saw action, which was a failure. However, they continued to be used and played an important part in stopping the German spring offensives in 1918, and then breaking the German lines in the following summer, and were also used up till September 1918 because their numbers had dropped considerably due to attrition. Meanwhile, during 1916, the industrial company FAMH began working on a rival vehicle in the shape of the Saint-Chamond. This was named after the place that the company was based. Although this was strictly not a tank due to not having a turret, it is generally included as part of the French tank development during the First World War. The Schneider company refused to share various patents of their design with the FAHM, which meant that they were required to develop the tank on the orders of the army from scratch. Again, being based on the Holt tractor, the Saint-Chamond suffered from having tracks that were too short, with an overhanging chassis. This meant poor trench crossing abilities and a lack of manoeuvrability, with the nose digging in on occasion. However, it could achieve a top speed of 7.5 miles an hour if conditions allowed. As with all tanks in the First World War, the 8-man crew had to work in cramped and suffocating conditions within the vehicle, making it difficult to operate in the heat of battle. Despite these shortcomings, the Saint-Chamond mounted a 75mm howitzer, which was the largest weapon mounted on an armoured vehicle until 1941. As with the Schneider tanks, the Saint-Chamond had a less than decisive impact when it first entered service in May of 1917, with many of the first 16 tanks getting stuck in trenches at La Fale Mill. Later in the war, however, the heavy howitzer was used in mid-1918 to engage German field batteries at long distances, with some success as a mobile artillery vehicle. The final French tank type was the famous FT, which is sometimes referred to incorrectly as the FT-17. This light tank was the world's first to mount a fully rotating turret and has led to some to state that this was the world's first true tank. It was developed in parallel, but not conjunction, with the Schneider and the Saint-Chamond. The FT was radically different in design, being a light tank mounting either a 37mm gun or Hotchkiss machine guns, and having a crew of only 2. First in action in 1918, the vehicle proved to be far superior to the other French tanks, not only mechanically, but also in its battlefield role. It was used widely by the American Army, and some were also used by the British Army as command tanks, and also by Italy. It outproduced the other French tank types, with eventually over 3,000 being manufactured. Usage of the tank went beyond the First World War and into the Second World War, with Germany, for example, using FT tanks in anti-partisan operations. Allegedly, a number were still being used in the Soviet-Afghan War between 1979 and 1989. Now, with the history out of the way, let's get to the painting. The model is already assembled when bought, so there's no need to do a huge amount except open the box. I superglued the model to the top of an old Vallejo paint bottle so that I can hold it easier, and then I sprayed the entire model in burnt umber spray. I'm going to put a list of products I use in the video description down below. When the primer is dry, I began painting the camouflage. The First World War was a time of experimentation, and camouflage was one of the things that was tried in various styles, with various results. I'm using the surviving example of a Saint-Chamond as a guide for this. I begin by adding stripes of Vallejo's dark sand in random places across the chassis of the tank, not forgetting the top and some of the underside. It's probably worth going back and applying a second coat of the paint, even though it is quite rich pigment. The next colour I use for the 4-tone scheme is Vallejo's Field Blue. I use this as a match for French uniform Horizon Blue on my infantry, so it seemed right to use it here. As before, it's a case of painting random stripes across the body of the model. Try to be as random as you can here, as the camouflage was supposed to break up the straight edges of the vehicle. Then lastly, I use reflective green, again by Vallejo, to add the green parts of the camouflage. I tried to fill in the areas between the two previous colours, but also leave some of the brown showing through, as this is our 4th tone in this scheme. Make sure the paint is not too thick, but thick enough that it goes on evenly. You can always go back and repaint areas once you've finished. Once all the paint of the camouflage is dry, I then add Agrax Earth Shade to the entire model. This wash will seep into the nooks and crannies of the model and add a layer of shading for us. The brown colour will also work well against the earthy tones of the camouflage colours. Allow the Agrax to dry thoroughly, preferably overnight, and then it's time to begin the highlighting. Now, there are a number of ways of doing this, and if you want, you can dry brush the camo, but I find you need to be incredibly neat with such small areas. So I found this way of doing it a little bit easier, even though it takes a little longer. I take the base colour of the camo and very carefully, and using a small brush, I repaint the camo colours, leaving a small edge around the shape and only hitting the actual high areas of the model. This is a very basic modular effect that can be used by scale modelers with an airbrush. At this scale, it's simpler to use a brush, and you won't see any mistakes at tabletop distance anyway. For this stage, I reuse the original base colours, including chocolate brown by Vallejo for the brown camo. You could do another highlight by lightening the original colours if you want to, but I didn't bother. You'll also notice that I didn't bother painting the black lines on the original example. This is because it's difficult to get right, and you would barely see them on the tabletop anyway. If you have a steady hand and a tiny brush, then go for it. Okay, we have the basic camouflage painted and highlighted, so it's time to finish off the details. This includes the tracks and the exhaust running across the top of the chassis. I paint both of these in black as a base colour, making sure to be as neat as possible here. When the black has dried, I use Vallejo's Gunmetal Grey and do a quite strong dry brush style painting across the top of the tracks and the exhaust. This is meant to pick out the highest parts of the tracks and exhaust while also leaving some of the black showing below. Then when the gunmetal has dried, I use Flory Rust Wash to go over the tracks and exhaust. This clay wash has a really nice pigment, and although it goes on bright, once it dries it becomes a nice darker rusty colour which has a slight texture to it. Then finally I use Decor Art Fawn to dry brush a tide mark of dust and stains around the bottom of the model. This is quite like khaki in colour, so that can be used in place, but it looks like dry mud and muck without taking the eye away from the rest of the model. Then I give it a quick spray with Winsor & Newton Professional Artist Matte Spray Varnish to seal the model, and we're done. I've fixed the model to a base and I'm finished. I didn't show making the base in this video, but you can see how I do this in other modelling videos on the channel. The techniques I've shown here are very simple and can easily be done with a little practice. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please leave a like and a comment, check out the rest of the channel and please subscribe if you haven't already.